Hi everyone, let's talk about fanfiction. I don't feel like I have to justify my love of fanfiction, that's not what this is, but I do feel like fanfiction is everywhere and you've probably read some. I've been thinking a lot this past year about why fanfiction just kind of hits harder sometimes than published books. Because if you know, you know. When I look back at my actual list of favorite books that I read this year, if I'm being honest, fanfiction fills the top 10. So the majority of what we read in this day and age actually is probably fanfiction at this point, because there have been so many created worlds. Everything is going to start feeling a little bit derivative. If it started out as fanfiction, I guess that's at least just honest. It's a chance to take characters that exist in our shared consciousness, ones that mean something to the author, but also to the readers. So it's like a shared thing, and find something new to say. The characters in the worlds are there in black and white, and the often undiscovered and often very talented authors can color them in. Is there a lot of smut in this world? You bet your ass. Is there anything wrong with that? Hell no. If that's what you're looking for, I love that journey for you. And I'm not saying that I don't enjoy the spiciness as much as the next person, but I want to stress that that isn't all the fanfiction world is. I've read some Hermione's this year that actually gave me a better understanding of politics, religion, the human psyche, the horrors of war, and what it means to be a human more than anything else I've experienced. And if there's some titillating romance or spice or an earth-shattering human connection between two people, well, like, what's wrong with that? I'm sorry if I'm coming off defensive, I don't mean to be. Let's talk about some fanfiction that was deemed good enough to enter the world of published books. And I'll start with some fanfiction that you might think of when you hear published fanfiction. So it's pretty common knowledge that Harry Styles has had two published works published about him. One of those is The Idea of You, and that was made into a movie, and I know that most people know that was about him. I haven't read that book, but he was also the inspiration for the After series by Anna Todd. The After series has Wattpad vibes, and I'm not super proud of having read that entire series, but I read that entire series, and looking back, it wasn't without its viewpoint. It explored the nature of an angry young man and the things that lead someone to be guided by anger and like her psyche and dealing with that. I mean, there were some good things there. Perhaps you are a Twilight girly. You obviously know that 50 Shades of Grey began as Twilight fanfiction, but there's been a lot. Gabriel's Inferno by Sylvain Renard and Beautiful Bastard by Christina Lauren also started as Twilight fanfiction. But when I Googled published books, what published books began as Twilight fanfiction, over 100 came up. Let's talk about what is arguably one of the biggest fanfiction universes out there, which is the Star Wars universe, specifically Reylo. It seems like there's the most about Kylo Ren and Rey. The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. Just look at that cover art. I mean, that was the original cover art created for the original fan fiction, and she didn't change it. She just slapped that on the, her original fiction version of it. But she also has 3 short novellas that also began as Reylo fanfics. I'll put those right here. The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston, which I have read. There are some definite clues in there that is meant to be Star Wars. The main character's name is Ben. You get the idea. You Again by Kate Goldbeck. Not Another Love Song and Forget Me Not by Julie Soto. And Julie Soto writes in the Harry Potter fanfiction world too. So she's a fanfic girly. We love her. And also We'd Know By Then by Kristen Bowling is a Reylo. And The Hurricane Wars by Thea Guanzon. Let's talk about Harry Potter fanfiction. So I just discovered that The City of Bones by Cassandra Clare is a Drinny, which is Draco and Ginny. That's how it started, and I didn't know that. So I immediately put that on my TBR because I've been kind of craving Draco and Ginny. Also, apparently Fangirl by Rainbow Rowell started out as a Drarry, which is Draco and Harry fanfiction. So there you go, I might read that one too. Olivia Blake writes a lot of Harry Potter fanfiction, and her original fiction, which is Masters of Death and Atlas 6, I mean, read that and tell me that's not Harry Potter fanfiction. It is. Of course, soon to be released are potentially my 3 favorite Hermione fanfictions, which are, Draco Malfoy and the Mortifying Ordeal, which is coming out as The Irresistible Urge to Fall for Your Enemy, The Auction by Julie Soto, which is coming out as Rose and Chains, and Manacled by Sen Lin Yu, which is coming out as Alchemized, all coming out next year. If you want more Harry Potter fanfic recs, follow me. Let's talk about fairy tale fanfiction. One of my favorite books that I read last year was Rouge by Mona Awad. And that was definitely what I would call a twisted fairy tale, but, it counts. Ella Enchanted and Fairest by Gail Carson Levine are pretty famous fairy tale fanfictions. Confessions of an Ugly Stepsister by Gregory Maguire, and there's just tons more. Are you a Sarah J. Maas girly? When you read ACOTAR, did you get Beauty and the Beast fanfiction vibes? Of course you did. Did you know that Throne of Glass began as Cinderella fanfiction? I didn't, but, now I can see that it was there. All of these books take this fairy tale world we're all familiar with and introduce a solid and often darker point of view to say something about the world. And speaking of Gregory Maguire, how about the story that has been shoved in our face for months? Wicked! This is Wizard of Oz fan fiction that gets into othering and oppression in more depth, as well as the nature of good and evil. Really, really good. How about one of the best books of the year? On the list for all the prizes, James by Percival Everett. It gets into the racism and the dehumanization and the hypocrisy that the original kind of glosses over. And speaking of kind of correcting an ill in the original, Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. This is Jane Eyre fan fiction, but it's the story of Bertha, the mad woman in the attic. Gives her her whole life and her whole, justification for the way that she was. Also, speaking of Jane Eyre, Jasper Fforde has a series about detectives traveling through books, and the first one is called The Eyre Affair, and it is fantastic. It's so awesome. I forget which one in the series it is, but there's one scene in one of his books where they're doing group counseling in Wuthering Heights. So funny. It's a great series if you like that kind of thing. Let's talk about Pride and Prejudice fan fiction. The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow, I have not read. It's on my TBR. Longbourn by Joe Baker, which I did read. It's about the servants of the Bennet home. That's really good. Death Comes to Pemberley by P.D. James. That's murder mystery P&P fan fiction. I personally loved The Bar Sinister by Linda Birdall. I think it's also called Elizabeth and Darcy, which picks up right after their wedding. It's steamy, but there's a lot going on in it. It's really good. Or, of course, we've also got a lot of modernizations. You can't tell me that Romantic Comedy by Curtis Sittenfeld does not trace back to Pride and Prejudice, as well as Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, which is, I don't know if I would call that fan fiction as much as definitely a love letter to it, but, it might have started there. And of course, Bridget Jones' Diary by Helen Fielding, which is a great one. Let's talk some classics. Something else that I really love is Arthurian literature. I studied that in college. Did you know that Lancelot was not in the original stories and he was a fan fiction creation by a French poet named Chrétien de Troyes? I love the notion that France, who has always had a complicated situationship with England, was like, let us take your lovely story of this hero guy Arthur and just make his wife cheat on him with a Frenchman. That's just so petty. How about The Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley? This is incredible. It definitely began as a steamy Arthurian fan fiction, but just grew into something so much more. The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which I think is one of the best books about political structures that I've ever read, indeed began as Arthurian fan fiction, as did A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, in which Mark Twain uses Arthurian fan fiction to point out the ills of his own era. Let's talk about Greek mythology. Obviously, Circe and Song of Achilles are definitely Greek mythology fan fiction by Madeline Miller that just took those stories and elevated them to convey so much more. James Joyce's Ulysses is, Odyssey fan fiction. And also the Aeneid by Virgil is definitely a fan fiction of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And very, very lastly, sorry this video is so long, Paradise Lost by John Milton and Dante's Inferno are both biblical fan fiction. So after all that, what's your favorite fan fiction?